Finland used to be a Russian colony. Poland used to be a Russian colony. What if Putin decides that he wants those countries back too?
If in 20 years, Canada formed a military alliance with China and invited China to put military forces in Canada, what do you think the United States would do?
Putin has already got what he wanted, Ukraine's neutrality. So how much Ukrainian land are you willing to give him for peace? And how do you sell it to the Ukrainians?
You just want to keep in mind here what the issue on the table is. We're talking about how to end this war. We're not talking about what happened in Libya in 2011. Really, who cares? The question is, how do we end this war? And it really matters because of what's happening to the Ukrainian people and because of the threat of nuclear war. And the argument on the table is that you have to pay serious attention to Russian interests. And when you talk about Russian interests, it's what they think their interests are. Now, Mike and Radek go to great lengths to try and describe what they think Russia's interests should be. And I think the Bill Burns quote is very important here, because Bill Burns, unlike you, said that NATO expansion is the brightest...
Didn't happen.
Putin has already got what he wanted, Ukraine's neutrality. So how much Ukrainian land are you willing to give him for peace? And how do you sell it to the Ukrainians?
There's no question that the Ukrainians have voice, and there's no question that the Ukrainians have agency. But the problem is, when you live next door to a guerrilla, if you do certain things that antagonize the guerrilla is going to come after you and do horrible things to you. You might not like this, but this is the way...
Canada living next to the United States? Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, Canadians should understand this.
Yeah, just on this point, I want to ask all the Canadians in the audience a very simple question. If in 20 years, Canada formed a military alliance with China and invited China to put military forces in Canada, what do you think the United States would do? I guarantee you the United States would behave towards Canada in very similar ways to how Russia is behaving towards Ukraine. We have the Monroe Doctrine, and we would never tolerate Chinese forces in Canada. We would never tolerate Canada forming a military alliance with China. You might not like this, but this is the way the world works. And I believe Canadians are sophisticated enough to know that this is a bad idea.
Okay. I need to respond to this because I think this is relevant. Under what conditions would the Canadians seek a Chinese alliance? Only if there was an American president who announced that to make America great again, he needs to reunite with part of what was once the same country, and they speak English too, don't they?
Have you ever asked yourself why the Ukrainians are doing so well against the Russians? It's not simply because of Russian military incompetence. It's because we have been arming the Ukrainians, we have been training the Ukrainians, we have been including them in military exercises like Operation Sea Breeze. Right? We have been integrating them in very subtle ways into NATO. And furthermore, as I said before in my rebuttal, we have made a series of declarations over the course of 2021 where we made it clear that the declaration that we made at the Bucharest summit in 2008 was alive and well. This is why the Russians were scared stiff that Ukraine was going to become part of NATO. This is why in mid-December of 2021, the Russians made it very clear they wanted a written guarantee from the United States and from NATO that said Ukraine would not become part of that alliance. They were scared, and they were scared because Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of the alliance.
I think it's a sign of realism on the part of President Zelensky. He has heard that he is not going to be admitted into NATO because we respect Russia's security interests. So there was no need, according to the realist theory, this war has been completely pointless.
You keep saying...
Because NATO membership is just not on the cards. What the real reason for this war is that Putin wants Ukraine. And the reason why I think there will not be a diplomatic settlement is that if you are the leader of a democracy, you have politics too, and you can't concede territory. You know, how much territory of your own country could you concede and remain in power? You have rivals who will eat you alive if you do that. So I think this is going to be a frozen conflict writ large for many years, for as long as Putin is in power.
Okay, but Mike's argument is that we don't work out a settlement because that involves appeasing Putin. That involves turning Ukraine into a neutral buffer state. We don't do that. So instead, what we do is we continue to arm Ukraine, we continue to get more deeply involved, and we try to help Ukrainians to decisively defeat the Russians in Ukraine. And furthermore, with our sanctions, we bring the Russians to their knees. And we ultimately, as I said in my opening comments, we knock them out of the balance of power, okay? The question you want to ask yourself, and this is the question all of you want to ask yourself, is where does this lead, right? Just think about what Ukraine is going to look like. Just think about the threat of nuclear escalation. The longer this war goes on, the more likely it is the Americans will become involved. The more likely it is that the war will turn nuclear. This would be a disaster of the first order. We have a deep-seated interest in shutting this one down now. And that means paying serious attention to what the Russians consider to be their interests. And their main interest is to make Ukraine a neutral state.
Quick answer to this question, John. Does that mean recognizing the territory that Russia has occupied in Ukraine?
I think, as Steve said before, that has to be decided in the final peace agreement.
Yeah.
So that's not Russia's national security interest,
But
right?
what do you think?
So that's, just to point out, that's a disagreement between our colleagues and Putin. You keep saying Russia's interest, but that's what he said. He said it very clearly that that's in his interest.
To answer Jadis's question, my personal view is that if you got a deal that created a really, truly neutral Ukraine, you could get the Russians to give up everything except Crimea.
How do you know that? How do you know that Putin
No,
doesn't...
I said that's my opinion.
How do you know that Putin doesn't redefine his interests further? You know, Finland used to be a Russian colony. Poland used to be a Russian colony. What if Putin decides that he wants those countries back too?
In case you haven't noticed, Putin is not even capable of conquering Ukraine. The idea that he's going to conquer Poland is laughable in the extreme.
They did so many times in the past.
The past is the past. There's a new balance of power in Europe.
Well,
and by the way, Radek, if you're...
all I can say is I would prefer the Ukrainians and the Finns in the trench beside me than some people that are current members. I want to give credit where credit is due. Professor Mearsheimer in 1994 did advise Ukraine to keep their nuclear weapons. And whether that or the hypothetical possibility of joining NATO would be a bigger threat to Russia, make your own judgment. But he is now saying that if Putin were about to lose, he might nuke Western Ukraine. And I actually fear that you might be right. That he would calculate that nuking Ukraine would not actually lead to a nuclear exchange with NATO because Ukraine is not a member. And it would cut the supply routes of Western equipment to the rest of Ukraine. And they talk about and they exercise their very nasty doctrine of escalate to de-escalate, which means use nukes, stun everybody into paralysis, and in that time achieve your military and political aims. I think this is the likelihood of this is not high, but it's not zero either. This would be the most dangerous point for the world, but also for Putin, because if he gives such an order, his generals will have the choice either to commit genocide or to take him out.
I was probably the only person in the West who said that Ukraine should not give up its nuclear arsenal. And my argument was because someday the Russians may threaten to invade Ukraine, and Ukraine should have nuclear weapons. The vast majority of people in the West, and many Ukrainians, said at the time that Ukrainians and Russians are basically blood brothers and blood sisters, and that's inconceivable. And therefore, John Mearsheimer's views are out of touch with reality. In a way, Mike, people were arguing at the time views similar to what Putin said in his July 12, 2021 article. Anyway, we took away their nuclear weapons. Then we encouraged them to join NATO. We said they were going to join NATO. We, in effect, poked the Russian bear in the eye, and we left them defenseless. In effect, have led the Ukrainians down the primrose path.
What's the poking of the bear that the Ukrainians did? Can you define that? How did they poke them? Very concretely, what's the evidence of poking?
Just
gotta have a little bit of data.
I'll give Mike a 30-second answer.
Yeah.
When
did they poke them?
We poked them in the eye.
No. When did the Ukrainians poke the bear, and that's why they had to invade Ukraine?
By going along with NATO expansion.
Just to be clear, it hasn't happened. So we keep such a weird debate.
Of course,
Ukraine's not in NATO.
Of course, it hasn't happened, and the Russians are bent on making sure it doesn't happen.
Because Germany and France vetoed it at the NATO summit, at which I was present.
Stephen?